December 29, 1942. Manchester, England rain moved in thin, uneven lines over the blackout city. Each drop struck the tin roofs with a tired rhythm, lost among the hum of distant factories still running on borrowed power. Inside a small maintenance hut behind the Northern Munitions plant, Sergeant Harold Minton sat beside a dead generator. The light from his lantern trembled against the wet walls. His gloves were damp, his breath short and visible. The smell of burnt oil and wet wool hung heavy. Regulations pinned above the door reminded him of his orders. Wait for official components from London. They would arrive in 12 hours. But the storm outside had already cut 2 transmission lines. If the generator wasn't repaired, the plant and the searchlights it powered would go dark by nightfall. Minton leaned closer to the machine. The copper coils were stripped, insulation burned away by last night's surge. He knew what it needed: a precise gauge of wire, properly sealed, properly signed off. None of that existed here. Only scraps, fragments, and one rusted spool marked unfit for field use. The safe choice was to wait. The correct choice, according to the book, was to do nothing. But through the rain, the faint pulse of anti-aircraft guns echoed from the coast. Somewhere out there, enemy bombers were forming. The blackout sky would soon become a map for destruction. He unrolled the damaged spool, inspecting each brittle strand. The wire was thin, uneven, but still conductive. He glanced again at the notice board. Unauthorized modification of defense equipment. Court-martial offense. The line blurred before his eyes. His hands, trembling not from fear but from cold, reached for the pliers. A quiet click, the sound of decision. By afternoon, the rain had turned to mist. The hut's single bulb flickered as the improvised circuit began to hum. A smell of hot metal filled the air. Minton stepped back, listening. The old generator coughed, resisted, then turned. The vibration traveled through the floorboards, steady and mechanical. Outside, the perimeter lights revived. One by one, pale halos cutting through the fog. It wasn't regulation. It wasn't approved. But it worked. At 7 p.m., a German Heinkel formation crossed the coast. Searchlights over Manchester turned the night sky white. Batteries opened fire. Observers later confirmed the northern sector stayed lit. Bombs fell elsewhere. The plant remained untouched. At dawn, the inspection team arrived from London. They found the wire fix, soldered without authorization, wrapped with what looked like adhesive tape and steel scrap. The senior officer wrote one sentence in his report: "Generator restored through unsanctioned method. System integrity preserved. No medal, no commendation. Just another line in maintenance records, filed and forgotten." Weeks later, the same generator powered the assembly line for anti-aircraft shells used over the channel. The patched wire remained in place until war's end. The men who inspected it later called it Minton's glue and wire fix, though his name never left the ledger. Steel won't remember who tightened the bolt. Circuits don't record hesitation. They only obey current. Would you have waited for London or turned the switch? Before the war, Harold Minton worked in a tram depot outside Leeds. The workshop was small, its windows clouded with years of soot. He spent his days bent over metal, tracing faults others had already written off as scrap. Co-workers called him slow. They said he wasted time on hopeless pieces. Yet, day after day, the trams left his bay running smoother than before. Minton never argued. He spoke through precision. A tightened bolt, a sealed wire, a hum restored to steady rhythm. To him, every machine held memory. It remembered how it once worked, if someone listened long enough. When war began, the depot's silence changed to the roar of mobilization. Minton was assigned to the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, his tools repacked under military inventory. In the new order, patience became inefficiency. Improvisation became risk. Each task had to follow the manual, each repair stamped, each hour accounted for. But some habits survived discipline. Minton still carried a small tin in his breast pocket. Glue, wire scraps, a strip of insulation tape folded twice over. Civilian relics. They weren't regulation, but they were familiar. A craftsman's safety net against failure. He cleaned his tools the same way he always had. Rag soaked in solvent, slow circular motion, the steel warming under his palm. The routine steadied him. Others smoked or joked to pass the time. Minton worked through silence. He believed reliability came not from power, but from rhythm, from knowing the exact resistance of a stubborn thread, or the faint vibration before a fuse failed. Machines spoke in quiet signals. Most men were too loud to hear them. In 1942, when he was transferred to Manchester's munitions district, that silence grew heavy. The city worked without pause. Night shifts under blackout curtains, sparks from grinders hidden behind heavy drapes. He learned to measure fatigue in the hum of motors, to sense when a generator strained. Each failure meant delay. Each delay meant darkness. When he arrived at the maintenance hut that winter, he found the same patterns he'd known his whole life. Burnt copper, stripped casing, overworked bearings. Only now, a misstep could black out a city. By then, Minton's reputation had become a quiet rumor among the crews. They said he could make anything run. Pumps, welders, even a broken radio with no proper coil. Some joked that he could power a convoy on stubbornness alone. He ignored the talk. His faith was in method, not miracle. Glue and wire, pressed steady, made systems live again. He trusted that over theory, over orders written far away. That night, as the rain gathered on the hut's roof, his hands moved with the same calm they once did on tram lines. The same patience his officers called wasteful now dictated each movement. Strip, twist, bind, seal. It was the rhythm of repair, a ritual older than the war itself. The war demanded speed, but survival came from care. By dawn, the generator turned. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. Power returned to the lines, and the searchlights burned through the fog. His small tin sat open beside him. Glue smudged, wire ends blackened, tools arranged in neat order. He would clean them again before morning inspection. Metal remembers the hands that mend it. Systems endure because someone refuses to let them fail. Would you have trusted the manual or your own hands? The power station that supplied Manchester was more than a facility. It was a living artery, feeding light and current into the northern body of Britain's war industry. Its circuits reached across 40 square miles, into factories, foundries, rail yards, and air defense posts. Voltage maps were drawn by hand in the early days of the Blitz. Each transformer bore a number stenciled in white, each junction recorded in a bound logbook signed in ink. Nothing moved in silence. When current flowed, it sang through the lines, a pulse measured, logged, and repeated. Minton's section maintained the outermost chain. He and his men worked in huts spaced across the county, small relay points between stations. They checked meters, replaced coils, and signed forms in triplicate. Every switch was regulated by order. Every failure reported through ranks. The system demanded discipline, predictability over initiative. It was built to run like clockwork, and like any clock, it feared improvisation. By 1942, the grid was stretched thin. Airfields had multiplied faster than new substations could be built. Anti-aircraft sites drew heavy current each night. Runway lights took the rest. One fault could darken 100 square miles. Engineers worked in overlapping shifts, never sleeping more than 4 hours at a time. Still, the system held a network of copper veins and human endurance. In that design, every node mattered equally. Yet each node was forbidden to act alone. The manuals were clear. No unsanctioned repair, no substitute materials, no deviation from London's code. That was how the structure survived, by removing judgment from the field. Minton understood it, even respected it. But in practice, The same rigidity that ensured stability also created paralysis. A single failed generator, waiting for parts, could silence 5 towns. The rain that night blurred the telegraph lines. Reports lagged. Orders stalled. The London warehouse closed at 6:01 p.m. The chain of authorization would resume at dawn. Until then, the entire northern sector existed in procedural suspension. A blackout waiting to happen. Inside Minton's hut, the silence of that system became audible. A generator stood still, not for lack of fuel, but for lack of permission. The irony was plain to every technician in Britain's wartime grid. The structure built for resilience could not survive human waiting. Every layer of oversight insulated the system from failure and from repair. Steel towers stood tall, cables thick with frost, but the lifeblood of the grid was paper. Paper with signatures. Paper that could not conduct current. Minton's task, officially, was to guard a dead circuit until help arrived. Unofficially, he was the last link between blackout and continuity. The network had no room for instinct, yet depended entirely on men who could act before instruction. That contradiction powered the war as much as electricity itself. By dawn, the current flowed again. The grid never noted how. Reports would list temporary restoration by local personnel. The lights stayed on. The records stayed clean. Systems survive because someone disobeys in silence. Would you have followed the order or restored the current? By afternoon, the hut had taken on a weight of its own. The air felt thick, part damp, part current. The voltmeter needle wavered, jerking between numbers that no longer meant certainty. A faint smell of ozone bled through the insulation. Smoke rose in soft curls from the secondary coil, too thin to see unless the lantern flickered. Minton rubbed his gloved thumb over the meter casing. The vibration beneath it wasn't steady anymore. The circuit was breathing unevenly. Outside, the usual sound of lorries had vanished. The fuel convoys that passed each hour were gone, rerouted south after the morning's air raid. Only wind moved now, pushing sleet against the siding. The silence between gusts was wider than before. Without the hum of engines, the war felt distant. A quiet waiting, stretched thin across the power lines. He opened the logbook and checked the timings. 3:42 p.m., voltage drop, minor. Temperature, rising. He noted each in pencil, then stopped halfway down the page. The smell of hot varnish drifted again, sharp enough to cut through wool and rain. Somewhere far off, sirens gave a brief, uncertain call. A test or a mistake? The sound reached him, hung for a second, and died. He leaned close to the machine. The secondary coil had begun to sweat, droplets forming along its casing. He touched the frame lightly. It was hotter than it should be. The grid was still alive, but its pulse was irregular. Minton stood still, listening. The hum of current ran through the concrete floor. Slow, stuttering, and out of rhythm. A living network, suffocating under its own caution. A voice cracked through the field radio. Words buried in static. Hold position. Engineers en route by nightfall. The transmission repeated twice, slower each time. Then silence. Minton looked at the handset. The cord coiled like a dead snake. Orders, always clear. Always late. He set the radio aside and checked his watch again. The minute hand crawled forward, heavy and deliberate. IP 44. PM outside. Daylight thin to the color of tin. Sleet hissed against the windows. He adjusted the regulator to relieve pressure, just enough to keep the line breathing. Sparks flashed briefly, then faded. The hum steadied. He exhaled. Not relief, just pause. The rule book said, observe, not act. But observation alone wouldn't stop a blackout. By 16 Wur, the generator casing rattled under its own strain. Minton could hear it even when he stepped back. The uneven tick of an overworked heart. He logged it in quiet handwriting. Stability declining. Awaiting engineers. He underlined nothing. He knew no one would read it until morning. The sleet turned heavier, sweeping sideways across the yard. Somewhere beyond the fog, transformers along the line began to click irregularly. Relay arms breaking pattern. A system designed for certainty was now running on hesitation. Inside the hut, Minton sat beside the generator. The voltmeter still trembled, its needle searching for a balance it would never find. He could feel the charge beneath his boots, restless and unsupervised. The network was weakening, not from enemy fire, but from its own obedience. Machines don't wait. People make them wait. Regulations forbade improvised joins. Every manual repeated the rule. A single spark could ground a line or burn a station. The text was absolute. No repairs without certified parts. No substitutions. No field improvisation. Minton had read it often enough to remember the phrasing by weight, not words. Yet as the sleet turned heavier and the voltage needle trembled near failure, he realized what the rule didn't say. It didn't account for silence. It didn't account for waiting while power bled away. He opened his pouch slowly, the gesture mechanical, deliberate. Inside were the things he wasn't meant to have: a tin of adhesive resin, a coil of stripped wire, and a narrow strip of metal salvaged from an old fuse bracket. Each piece carried memory. Each had once belonged to something that failed and been made to work again. He laid them out on the bench like instruments in a ritual. Outside, the convoy roads had gone quiet. The hum of engines, the metallic pulse of passing trucks, gone. Only wind and the faint buzz of distant current that refused to die. He could hear it in the floor, faint but stubborn. The generator was still alive, but its pulse was weakening. Minton turned the coil between his fingers. His father had taught him that wire wasn't just metal, it was trust. If the current's honest, he used to say, the wire will hold. In the tram shop, that had been gospel. Here, in uniform, it was heresy. He looked at the rulebook pinned to the wall, the official seal printed above neat instructions, then back to the generator's cracked insulation. The choice was simple: wait for permission, or act before the system stopped breathing. He tore a small strip of tape and began cleaning the copper ends. Each movement was unhurried. His breath fogged against the lantern glass. The sound of aircraft engines, distant, layered, pressed faintly through the sleet. No formation yet, but close enough that the air seemed to carry their rhythm. He tightened his grip on the wire. The smell of resin filled the hut. At 4:23, the voltmeter needle dropped, then flicked once, twice, and settled at 0. The current had broken. Minton did not look up. He stripped another inch of wire, sanded the edge of the bracket, and aligned the ends. The field manual called this a breach of procedure. He called it continuation. The adhesive hissed faintly as it sealed under his touch. A spark snapped, brief but contained. For a second, he froze. Then, slowly, the hum returned. Weak, uneven, but alive. He adjusted the bracket, pressing it firm until the sound stabilized. The light above flickered once, then held. The line had survived. He wrote nothing in the logbook, only wiped his hands, closed the tin, and listened. The aircraft sound had moved west. The system's pulse steadied beneath the concrete. The war outside went on, unaware that one unauthorized join had held an entire sector's light. Machines obey the hands that keep them breathing. Systems survive because someone chooses not to wait. At 6:07 p.m., Harold Minton broke regulation. The act was simple, almost unnoticeable. A man leaning over a machine, his breath steady, his tools quiet. But on paper, it was a violation worthy of discharge. He tore back the last layer of insulation and exposed the raw copper beneath. The air smelled of damp cloth and ozone. The rulebook said stop. The current demanded now. He mixed adhesive resin with a small brush, the bristles clotted and stiff from use. The mixture hardened too fast in the cold air, but he pressed it into place anyway. The damaged coil hissed faintly, alive under his touch. He wound stripped wire around the fracture, tight and uneven, each turn pulling current closer to order. From his ration stove, he drew a thin flame and passed it across the joint. Glue smoked. Sparks snapped. The light above him flickered, guttered, and then caught again. For a moment, he thought it would fail. Outside, fog rolled over the rooftops, the kind that swallowed both distance and sound. Beyond it, faint engine noise echoed, the distant pattern of aircraft turning inland. The city was invisible now, only shapes behind rain. He adjusted the voltage dial, felt resistance, and held it. The hum deepened. The relay clicked once, then again, precise and rhythmic, as if the circuit had remembered itself. He stepped back. The voltmeter needle rose and held steady. The generator's tone was lower than before. A quiet, stable vibration that carried through the floor and up his boots. The current had returned, rough around the edges but whole. Minton exhaled. He wiped his forehead, not realizing the sweat was mostly rain. He checked his wristwatch. 6:10 p.m. Less than 3 minutes since the break. To the system, nothing had happened. To the night, everything had. He closed the tin of resin, his hands trembling from effort. A small burn mark darkened the inside of his wrist, where the copper had sparked against skin. He pressed it once, then let it sting. No record would note it. No report would list it. The power lines outside carried on, their current merging into the larger rhythm of the grid. Minutes later, the streetlights along the northern edge flickered alive. Through the fog, faint halos formed above the wet pavement. Fragile, but real. Somewhere down the line, a siren wound up into readiness, its circuit restored by a repair no one had authorized. Minton stood still, listening. The hum was steady now. He could hear it beneath everything. The rhythm of an industrial body restored by glue, wire, and a quiet act of defiance. There were no cheers, no observers, no confirmation of success. Only the faint glow outside, holding steady against the dark. He picked up his gloves and returned them to his pouch. The tin clicked shut. Rain continued on the roof, measured, exact, like a metronome counting the seconds of an unrecorded victory. The grid never knew his name. The light stayed on because a man decided not to wait for orders. Systems endure because someone breaks the rule at the precise moment it matters. Would you have risked the spark? Or watched the line go dark? At 7 to 12 p.m., the Luftwaffe reached the coast. Radar stations marked 20 aircraft crossing the North Sea. Altitude 10,000 feet. Course set for Manchester. The alerts moved inland by relay, post to post, along the same current Minton had kept alive. In the operations room, map pins shifted, phones rang once, and the chain of defense engaged. Searchlight teams along the perimeter reported full visibility. Beams rose through low cloud, sweeping the sky in coordinated arcs. Anti-aircraft batteries aligned by signal, each position powered through the same northern grid. Had the generator failed as predicted, the system would have collapsed in sequence. 5 towns into darkness, then the airfields, then the city itself. But the current held. The lights that should have failed remained steady, their circuits alive through one unrecorded repair. Above the channel, pilots saw the pattern from miles away, a faint, glowing grid beneath them, like a net of light stretched across the earth. The first intercepts began near the estuary. Searchlights caught the bombers' bellies, reflecting dull silver through fog. Fire control officers adjusted bearings by the second, their instruments ticking in rhythm. Shells burst between the formations. The city's defenders could see every turn. Down in the maintenance hut, the same rhythm echoed in smaller form, a steady mechanical pulse beneath the rain. Minton sat beside the humming generator, the lantern casting thin shadows across the floor. His logbook lay open to a clean page. He wrote with deliberate strokes. Power restored via emergency loop. The words were regulation safe, vague enough to satisfy any audit. He underlined nothing. Outside, faint vibrations passed through the concrete. The concussion of distant flak. He listened, counting the intervals between blasts. Somewhere in that invisible sky, men fought in circles of light he had unknowingly preserved. The system did not thank him. It simply worked. By 7:45 p.m., the reports filtered back. 4 bombers down, 2 damaged, none reached the industrial zone. The blackout chain that should have started at 1807 never came. Every circuit north of the city held its load. Command credited the efficiency of the network. London sent a brief note of commendation. Sector resilience confirmed. No mention of the hut. No mention of the man. Minton leaned back, his shoulders pressing against the cold wall. The resin on his hands had hardened into a dull crust. He closed the logbook, folded the pencil into the binding, and sat still. The hum of the generator filled the silence between distant artillery reports. He looked at the floor where the copper had scorched the boards and rubbed it with his boot until the mark faded. To the grid, the event never existed. To the record, the lights had never flickered. Yet for one winter night, a line of improvised copper had carried an entire sector through the dark. The war would remember the bombers, the guns, the pilots in the sky, but not the man who refused to wait for permission. Systems endure because someone, somewhere, ignores the manual long enough to keep them breathing. By dawn, the rain had stopped. The air carried the smell of cold soot and wet iron. The generator still ran, its hum lower now, but steady. Minton sat by it in silence, his logbook closed, gloves folded on the bench. The resin around the splice had hardened into a dull gray seam. It looked crude, functional, neither neat nor accidental. At 7:10 a.m., the inspection lorry arrived. 2 officers stepped out, followed by a senior engineer from London. Their uniforms were dry. They had traveled in heated comfort. The hut's floor was slick with mud. The lantern burned low. The engineer examined the repaired junction without speaking. He placed a gloved hand over the wire, felt the vibration of current, and looked at the meter. The needle held perfect center. No one asked what had happened. No one asked who had done it. The senior engineer marked the logbook once, a clean line under the last entry. Under investigation. His voice was measured, almost indifferent. He noted that official parts had arrived by morning convoy, only a few hours late. The report would show that protocol had been followed, supply delivered, issue resolved. Minton stood aside while they recorded readings. The generator coughed once, then resumed its rhythm. One inspector wrote in small letters, "Temporary circuit integrity maintained despite improper repair." It was the kind of phrasing designed to close a file. The men finished their notes, stamped a seal on the report, and left without a word. Their boots left shallow prints in the thawing ground. He watched their vehicle drive away, exhaust hanging pale against the morning fog. For the first time in 12 hours, the hut felt empty, too quiet, too clean. He touched the wire once more, then switched off the lantern. His orders would come by noon, by week's end. Minton was reassigned to an auxiliary depot near York. The letter called it a strategic personnel rotation. No one mentioned the investigation, but everyone knew what it meant. The system had corrected itself, not through punishment, but through removal. Quiet competence had become procedural inconvenience. The depot was smaller, less vital, a warehouse for spare turbines and scrap. Minton went about his work the same way, cleaning tools, checking circuits, logging temperatures. He spoke little, wrote neatly, and carried the same small tin in his pouch. The men there called him the tram man, without knowing why. Elsewhere, factories resumed normal production. The Manchester plant reported 0 downtime. Searchlight crews along the coast filed their success, under favorable weather conditions. The foreman at the munitions plant later remarked in passing that someone up north kept the lights alive that night. but no name was attached, no citation issued. The report from the power station closed 2 weeks later. All records archived. The resin on Minton's repair held for the remainder of the war, never replaced, never mentioned again. For him, the silence was nothing new. Systems survived through men who worked unseen. And once a system survived, it no longer needed to remember how. Industrial endurance depends on invisible hands, those who act without permission and are quietly removed once order returns. Would you have waited for approval? Or kept the current alive knowing it would cost your name? Years later, after the war, Harold Minton returned to the same tram depot outside Leeds. The roof leaked now. The paint on the girders had peeled in long, curling strips. Machines that once hummed through the blackout ran slower, belts slipping, gears groaning with age. Yet the sound, that low, constant rhythm of a motor turning, still steadied him. He stood where he had once repaired brake lines for the city trams, tracing the same floor markings he had left behind years earlier. Nothing in the depot had changed much, except the men. The younger fitters didn't know what he had done during the war. They only knew he'd been with maintenance, some forgotten branch of the electrical corps. When asked about the raids, he gave the same answer every time: kept things running. The phrase sounded ordinary, unimportant, but to him, it was the whole truth condensed into 4 words. No record mentioned his name. No commendation reached him. The generator in Manchester had been dismantled years before, replaced by newer models from London. The report remained in storage. A single line noting temporary circuit integrity maintained. The phrase outlived every man who had signed it. The wire he spliced, the resin he melted, the scar on his wrist, all of it belonged to a story the system had quietly erased. Still, the grid he'd saved became legend in another form. Engineers who worked through the blackout cities began to repeat a quiet rule. No one wrote it down, but everyone knew it. Sometimes the system depends on the one who breaks it. Carefully. It was passed from workshop to classroom, depot to station. Not as defiance, but as duty. The understanding that machinery, like men, doesn't wait for orders when silence threatens to stop everything. Minton never corrected anyone. He fixed what was broken, cleaned his tools, and walked home with oil on his sleeves. On Sundays, he sat in the depot office, the one with the cracked clock and the smell of burned insulation. He would listen to the trams starting outside, each spark jumping between pole and wire, each connection humming into life. It sounded the same as that night, the faint thrum of current moving through wet air, refusing to die. He never spoke of Manchester. The war had ended, the lights stayed on, and that was enough. To him, victory wasn't a flag or a parade. It was the moment a system recovered without anyone noticing. Quiet success meant survival. Silence meant the machine still worked. By the time he retired, the depot had new supervisors, new methods, new manuals. His name disappeared from the roster. But in every station powered by men who understood the value of one unapproved repair, his legacy moved unseen, like current through hidden wire. Electricity and loyalty share one trait. Both fail in silence before they are seen. Would you have trusted the fix or waited for permission? January 14th, 1944. Bremen, Germany. Frost covered the yard like ash. The ground was hard enough to ring under boots, each step echoing between corrugated walls lined with ice. Above, the chimneys of the Bremen power complex sent up faint plumes, too thin to warm the air. Inside a small steel shed, engineer Karl Voss worked in silence, his breath forming clouds that drifted across the lamplight. The flame wavered, catching the edges of scattered detonator shells. Some cracked open, others half-assembled, their copper threads glinting dull gold. The bench before him was layered with failure. 7 prototypes lay still, each one a question. The stopwatch beside them ticked slow and steady, marking the delay intervals that refused to stay uniform. Voss adjusted his wireframe glasses and traced a fingertip across a fuse cap, scarred by heat. The readings from the last test had drifted again. 6 seconds late, then 9, then no detonation at all. The flaw was real. It wasn't mechanical fatigue, it was chemical variance in the new primer compound, unpredictable at low temperatures, the kind that factory supervisors hated and field engineers feared. Beyond the frost-glazed window, truck engines idled. Headlights flickered through the wire fence, cutting across the mist in brief white arcs. A guard's boots moved past, rhythm steady, rifle slung low. Somewhere deeper in the complex, a generator hummed like a slow heartbeat. Voss noted the rhythm, then returned to the fuses. He wasn't supposed to think beyond precision. His task was correction, not innovation. But the reports from the Eastern Front lingered in his mind. Allied engineers clearing unexploded bombs within hours, rebuilding runways in less than a day. A uniform fuse made clearance predictable. A flawed one might not. He marked another note in his ledger. Temperature, delay, variance, and stopped. His pencil hovered. The lantern flickered once more, then steadied, revealing the small tremor in his hand. The officer in charge, Hauptmann Richter, would arrive by dawn. The man preferred numbers neat and identical, signatures stacked like bricks. Anything else was waste. But a staggered detonation pattern could choke Allied airfields longer than any precision strike. It could turn every crater into a waiting trap, each one uncertain, each one feared. Voss stared at the stopwatch again. Its second hand swept clean, untroubled. He pressed the detonator switch for the next test. The charge clicked, then held. 4 seconds, 5, nothing. He waited. On 7, the blast arrived. A muffled thud from the test pit beyond the wall. Dust lifted from the rafters. The delay was irregular again. He exhaled through his teeth. A defect, yes, but an intelligent one. By 03:47 hours, the yard had fallen quiet. The trucks shut down. The air settled back into frost and metal. Voss leaned against the bench, the lantern's flame shrinking as the oil thinned. His logbook remained open beside the last fuse, the words incomplete. One entry read, delay consistent under error. Possible field advantage. He knew what the officer would demand. Correction, conformity, signature. He also knew what this imperfection could do once scattered across an airfield at night. He closed the ledger, wiped his hands on the hem of his coat, and turned toward the silent trucks waiting beyond the fence. Steam curled from their exhausts, dissolving into the black sky. Somewhere, a bell marked the shift change, distant and hollow. The stopwatch still ticked on the bench, measuring nothing now, just the distance between hesitation and obedience. By dawn, Voss would hand over his report. The delay data would be marked acceptable. The flaw would remain uncorrected. Months later, Allied engineers clearing runways across northern France would describe the same phenomenon. Bombs that waited. 10 seconds, 30, sometimes an hour. Each sound that followed a silence made men flinch long after the last detonation. Industrial systems are not built on perfection. They win through endurance, through the repetition of almost correct machines that never truly fail. Would you have fixed the fuse, or let the flaw live? Before the war, Karl Voss's world was measured in revolutions per minute. His days began with the hum of turbines along the Elbe, the rhythm of water pumps feeding the shipyards. He preferred the company of machines to men. Steel obeyed rules, and rules could be trusted. In his small maintenance shed outside Hamburg, every wrench had a numbered place, every coil a label in his ledger. His mother once said he was born with rhythm in his ears. She meant music, but what Karl heard was pattern, steam pressure, piston cycles, the pulse of voltage through copper lines. When the draft order came, it didn't send him to the front. It sent him deeper into machinery. The Reich's Ministry for Armaments needed precision workers, and Karl's reputation for method made him a candidate for the Luftwaffe's fuse laboratories. He traded turbine noise for the sharper scent of detonators and solder. The workroom near Bremen felt colder than any dockside morning. No sunlight, only the white glare of lamps and the hiss of cooling agents. His old notebooks now filled with voltages, delay readings, and failures. The entries no longer recorded maintenance, but design. Machines made to destroy. He found his rhythm again. Measure, file, test, repeat. The ritual steadied him, even as the meaning of the work hollowed out. He never wrote opinions in his reports, only results. The system rewarded silence, and he understood that silence was a form of survival. But fatigue crept in, not the kind that dulled his hands, but one that pressed into his thoughts. Each improvement he perfected returned through reports written in coded language. Detonation yield satisfactory. He knew what those words meant. Somewhere, a man was not walking home. When the fuse trials began to fail, Karl didn't react with anger. He watched. The detonators behaved like living things, some precise, others hesitant, a few completely inert. At first he suspected corrosion or a flaw in the primer compound. But the error pattern shifted with the weather. Readings stable in the morning drifted by nightfall. The inconsistency wasn't mechanical, it was environmental. A bimetal coil inside the timing unit expanded unpredictably under temperature changes. A small imperfection, invisible to the eye, measurable only by patience. He logged the data over 3 nights: temperature, pressure, delay, interval. The chart curved irregularly. It shouldn't have. Each deviation widened the more he repeated the test. The more he measured, the more alive the fault became. Chaos masquerading as science. The fuse, in theory, was broken. Yet in application, it could become something else. A pattern of uncertainty that would make any field technician hesitate before touching a bomb. It could multiply fear. He didn't tell anyone. Not yet. The system demanded perfection. It did not tolerate useful disorder. But Karl saw a strange symmetry in the failure. Machines built for total control often depended on fractions of error. Systems breathed because of slight misalignments. A perfect engine stalls. An imperfect one endures. He cleaned his tools, arranged them by size, and wiped the oil from his hands. Outside, frost gathered along the window frame. The factory hum continued, a steady vibration through the concrete floor. He stood there, listening, counting the beats as he once counted turbine cycles. The flaw waited in his notes. It had no name, no entry in the manual, just a number written in faint pencil. He could erase it tonight, fix the coil, restore order. Or he could let the system absorb this small pulse of unpredictability, a delay that might outlive its maker. By dawn, he decided nothing. The lamp burned low. The stopwatch on the bench kept ticking, indifferent to choice. Even precision has a conscience. It asks questions quietly, beneath the sound of machines. Would you have erased the error, or trusted the flaw to do its work? By winter 1944, the factory no longer sounded human. It breathed through pistons and conveyor belts. A constant, mechanical rhythm that began before dawn and ended only when power failed. Steam drifted from vents in slow columns. The air inside the foundry was dense with the smell of graphite, hot oil, and dust. Each worker performed a motion that linked invisibly to the next. Pour, cool, grind, stamp. Molten steel into molds, brass into shells, precision into repetition. The rhythm never broke. Karl Voss watched from his station on the mezzanine, ledger in hand. Below him, crates lined the floor like tiles, everyone destined for an airfield on the channel front. Each contained the same component. The delay fuse he'd refined through nights of calculation. Each bore his initials stamped into the corner plate. The factory foreman called it efficiency. Carl called it fragility disguised as order. One cracked bearing in a rail car, one frozen junction in a freight yard, one misread number on a form, and the entire flow of the system would stall. He traced his pencil down the ledger, marking each outbound shipment by train number. Every delay fuse from his section would feed the Luftwaffe's aerial ordnance for Calais. Timing defined value. Too soon, and the blast lost its reach. Too late, and Allied engineers cleared the field before detonation. Command wanted obedience to formula. Detonation intervals exact, consistent, mathematical. But precision, Carl thought, was a luxury of stable conditions. And nothing in wartime Europe was stable. Beyond the factory walls, fog rolled across the rail yard. The cranes moved through it like gray shapes in water. Chains clanked. Freight cars filled with munitions drifted down side tracks, wheels screaming in short bursts before locking into place. Steam escaped from valves in brief sighs. Somewhere, a guard shouted through the haze, his voice muffled against the hum of diesel engines. Every link of the chain performed as expected, yet every link carried a margin of failure. The system's perfection existed only on paper. Carl returned to his bench. His logbooks spread across the table like maps of an unseen battlefield. Columns of resistance values, delay curves, and test anomalies. The data told a quiet truth. The system did not reward flexibility. It demanded alignment, even if the alignment led to fragility. His flaw, the temperature-induced delay variation, now lived in those numbers, hidden under layers of acceptable variance. No one else would notice. The report would pass review, but the effect would ripple outward through the supply chain, traveling by rail to depots, by convoy to airfields, by bomber to enemy soil. By midnight, the last train stood ready. Workers locked the crates into the freight cars, sealing each with wax and twine. The air smelled faintly of tar and coal. The signal lamp at the end of the platform blinked red, then green. Movement began again. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Carl leaned on the railing as the first locomotive exhaled and rolled forward, its steel wheels clanging against frozen rails. The vibration reached up through the metal floor. He knew the sequence that would follow. 2 days to Calais, sorting at depot, loading under airfield blackout, release by bomber over enemy territory. Each component, identical in design, would behave differently in the field. Some would detonate instantly. Others would wait, seconds, minutes, hours. The pattern of delay would stretch across time and geography like a slow echo. The factory returned to silence once the train departed. The cranes froze mid-rest. Lights dimmed. A draft moved through the empty corridor, stirring the papers on Carl's desk. He picked up the last page from his ledger. It bore a single notation beside the production total. Variance within tolerance. He closed the book, set down his pencil, and listened. Somewhere far beyond Bremen, the rhythm of the system continued. Wheels, valves, and decisions moving unseen through the dark. Machines do not question purpose. They only execute, and in that obedience lies both their strength and their blindness. By dawn, the yard would fill again. New crates, new trains, the same pattern repeating until the line broke from exhaustion. Perfection, Carl realized, was not what kept the system alive. It was the flaws that made it breathe. Would you have corrected the rhythm, or trusted the imperfection to keep the chain moving? By 05:40 a.m., the first warning came without alarm. Just a faint hiss beneath the clatter of the morning shift. A worker near the packing line stopped mid-motion, head tilted toward a crate stamped with red caution marks. The sound was brief, a slow release of pressure, almost like breath. Then a single click, hollow and dry. The men stepped back instinctively. Nothing followed. Silence pressed against the metal walls until even the steam valves seemed to hold still. Carl Voss arrived moments later, coat unbuttoned, gloves half on. He crouched beside the crate. The surface was cold but trembling faintly, a small pulse of vibration from within. He recognized the pattern, not detonation, not malfunction. The fuse inside had reactivated under temperature change. It had warmed, awakened, and stopped just short of ignition. He placed his hand on the lid, feeling for rhythm. The silence wasn't dead. It was suspended. Waiting. An officer entered. Hauptmann Richter, clipboard under his arm, voice clipped by impatience. The factory had no time for superstition. He called it static discharge, a fluke of cold metal meeting condensation. "Seal it. Move on," he ordered. The men obeyed, sealing the crate in wax and hauling it to the outbound rail queue. The hiss did not return. Richter ticked a box on his form. Order restored. But Carl remained near the empty space the crate had occupied, studying the frost on the floor. The heaters had switched on minutes before the noise. That was no coincidence. He returned to his bench, reopening his notes. Delay times had drifted again overnight. Longer, inconsistent, erratic. He ran a pencil down the column of figures. The pattern wasn't linear. It expanded under warmth, contracted in cold. The fuse had become sensitive not to time, but to its environment. He wrote a line in the margin. Delay dependent on ambient temperature. Unstable equilibrium. The words felt too alive. He crossed them out, replaced them with something less revealing. Thermal deviation, under review. Then he closed the book. Outside, the factory heaters groaned, metal ducts creaking as warm air crawled through the vents. The shift floor glowed faintly orange under the industrial lamps. Workers resumed their rhythm, lifting, sealing, stamping. The noise returned, swallowing the earlier unease. But beneath it, the same hiss came again. Not loud, not continuous. Just one brief exhale from a stack of crates waiting by the door. No one turned this time. Carl recorded each interval quietly. At 06:12 a.m., another unit delayed by 7 seconds beyond tolerance. At 06:34, 2/9. When the temperature reached full operating heat, the data drifted wider still. The variation was alive, unpredictable. To command, this would be failure. To Carl, it was potential. The kind of fault that could ripple through systems designed for control, turning precision into hesitation, safety into doubt. He adjusted his spectacles and began rewriting the production report. Each entry shortened, simplified. Delay within tolerance, repeated line after line. He stamped each page with the approval seal, the steel die pressing his initials into the paper. By 07:02, the forms were complete. The officer would find no irregularities. The numbers would pass the inspection chain without question. But in his private ledger, hidden beneath the false summary, Carl added a new note. Fuse delay reactive to heat. Possible tactical advantage, prolonged runway denial. He underlined it once, firmly. The heaters hummed. Frost melted from the windows, streaking down the glass in narrow trails. The floor trembled again as another train coupled to the loading dock. The factory rhythm resumed its steady beat. Obedient, relentless, unaware. Carl placed his ledger in the drawer and locked it. The key stayed in his hand for a long time. He didn't feel triumph, only the quiet awareness that something mechanical had crossed into instinct. A device now listened to its surroundings. It would wait, learn warmth, and strike when conditions aligned, like a system teaching itself delay. By the next shipment, the crates bore his signature once more. The officer saw precision. Carl saw something else moving beneath the numbers. A machine that had learned uncertainty. The factory clock marked 07:20 a.m. Steam drifted upward, slow and calm, as if the building itself were breathing. Every system hides its echo, the faint reminder that control is never complete. Would you have silenced the warning, or listened to what it was trying to say? By midday, the air inside the production hall had thickened with heat and urgency. The morning frost had lifted from the rail yard outside, leaving the factory's steel girders slick and glistening under a pale sun. Somewhere in the distance, a whistle signaled the arrival of a new transport train. Inside, orderlies moved between the benches with crates stacked to their shoulders. The tempo of the day had changed. No longer patient, no longer methodical. Command had sent a directive. All fuse units were to be shipped to northern depots by nightfall. Carl Voss stood at his workstation, his coat folded neatly on the hook behind him. The ledger lay open, its columns marked in pencil from a long night of recalculation. Each line represented a fuse, each number a delay interval tested under conditions that no longer fit the timetable. Regulations required another round of calibration before shipment. Standard procedure, non-negotiable. But the request from command was stamped urgent, signed by an adjutant in Calais who had no patience for decimals or temperature ranges. The factory foreman, Richter, recited the order twice in his usual clipped tone. Departure in 6 hours. No exceptions. He walked away without waiting for acknowledgement. The moment the door closed, Carl exhaled slowly and turned toward his instruments. The readings on the bench told the truth no one wanted written. The fuse curve had drifted again. It no longer followed regulation delay margins. Under rising heat, the variance spread wide, unpredictable, alive. To correct it would mean halting the line, delaying the shipment, inviting inspection. To ignore it meant something else entirely, a new pattern of consequence. He traced a finger over the dials, the pointer trembling near the edge of tolerance. In his mind, the calculations unfolded like clockwork. A bomb dropped at 06 hours, detonating not on impact, but at 06:05. A 5-minute silence in which the ground crew, the medics, the engineers, the ones who always came running first, would arrive. Then the blast. The delay would not just destroy, it would teach fear. The kind that lingered long after the smoke cleared. Machines don't think. Men do. His father had said it once, years before the war, while repairing a turbine shaft at the docks. Carl remembered the sound of that workshop. The same rhythm, the same hum of industry, but without the purpose of death. The words stayed with him now, buried beneath the noise of the factory around him. He stared at the production board. 2 paths lay before him, both written in the same mechanical order: calibrate or confirm. The forms left no space for conscience. A machine would have chosen calibration, the correction of error. But Carl wasn't a machine. He understood that systems built for uniformity could collapse under the weight of one deliberate imperfection. He picked up his pen. His hand didn't shake. The official report required a single phrase in the remarks section. Delay margin 0.1 sec. He inhaled once, slow and steady, and wrote the word confirmed. The pen scratched across the paper, sealing both the report and his silence. Outside, the air filled with the sound of locomotives coming to life. Pistons knocked, brakes hissed, chains clattered against couplers. The first train shuddered forward, wheels grinding over frost-stiff rails. Each crate loaded into its freight car carried his initials, his design, his decision. The vibrations from the floorboards climbed up through the soles of his boots, a reminder that the system had begun to move, unstoppable, indifferent. He stood at his desk for a long time after the others left. The factory now quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock and the echo of engines in the distance. His hand hovered above the ledger. He could still change it, erase the entry, start again, fix the flaw. But the pencil stayed still. The choice was already made. Silence had replaced compliance. By dusk, the trains were gone. The factory lights dimmed. A single fuse prototype sat on his bench, marked with a faint line of grease. He turned it once in his palm and set it down. The metal felt warm, almost alive. Systems, he thought, endure not because they are perfect, but because someone, somewhere, chooses when not to follow the rule. Would you have signed the form or stopped the machine? January 16, 1944. The yard outside Bremen lay under a thin crust of frost. Steel rails glinted pale in the weak light. Breath hung in the air, slow and heavy. At the far end of the siding, cranes lifted wooden crates one by one into waiting freight cars. The men moved carefully. Each box weighed more than it looked. Inside were delay-fused bombs, 312 in total. Their destinations printed in black ink. Calais Sector, Northern France. Karl Voss stood beside the manifest table, his gloved hands folded behind his back. The clipboard before him listed serial codes, resistance readings, and shipment designations. Every figure aligned perfectly. Every mark matched regulation. On paper, the system was flawless. But beneath the uppermost file, under the thick stack of signatures and seals, he slid a slim, unmarked logbook, his own. Its final entry described a truth no officer would ever read. Delay variance confirmed. Heat reactive instability. Do not correct. The officer in charge, Hauptmann Richter, arrived to sign the clearance. His boots struck the platform in steady rhythm, his breath leaving quick clouds in the cold. He gave the papers a cursory glance, nodded once, and stamped them with the Luftwaffe seal. Approved. Load complete, he said, before turning toward the siding to watch the convoy depart. The men saluted. Engines coughed awake, smoke curling through the air like worn fabric. Karl remained still, eyes on the rows of crates vanishing into the freight car's dark interior. He knew what lay within: fuses that would not obey time, bombs that would sleep and wake according to the sky's temperature, scattering destruction across hours instead of seconds. A flaw disguised as precision. He hadn't built them for sabotage. Not consciously, but something in him refused correction. The system wanted uniformity. He had given it unpredictability. When the last crate rolled inside, the latch slammed shut. The guard waved the flag. The locomotive groaned and began to move, slow at first, then steady. The iron rhythm filled the yard, a sound of weight in motion. Frost cracked beneath the wheels. The train disappeared into the low fog toward the west. Karl lingered by the presses. The factory floor had emptied, leaving only the faint hum of the idle generators. Rows of workbenches stretched into shadow, each one marked by repetition. Spools, clamps, wire cutters, the residue of oil and graphite. He walked the aisle slowly, fingertips grazing the cold edges of metal. The air smelled of burnt lubricant and dust. Somewhere deep in the machine hall, a valve released a tired hiss. He stopped by his test bench. The dials still glowed faintly. Instruments waited for instruction, needles resting at 0. He began turning them off, one switch at a time. The hum receded, the lights dimmed, the silence deepened. It wasn't resignation, it was something quieter. A pause within the rhythm of obedience. Beyond the rail fence, dawn began to press through the haze. A pale orange line spread over the horizon, cutting through chimney smoke. The cranes stood motionless, their arms like frozen sentinels. For the first time in months, Karl felt no movement inside the factory walls, only stillness. He looked down at his empty hands, oil-stained, scarred from years of work, and thought of what they had just done. Not sabotage, not rebellion, just a choice left unspoken. Somewhere far ahead on that westbound train, his design would meet the cold air above France. Metal would heat, expand, and wait. The pattern of delay would unfold across the enemy's airfields in silence. He walked toward the door. Behind him, the machines remained dark, the test bench quiet. Ahead, the tracks disappeared into fog. The system had moved on without him. Industrial systems survive through the obedience of thousands and the hesitation of one. 3 days later, Bremen was quiet under a low ceiling of gray. The factory whistles sounded at dawn as always. a thin metallic cry that disappeared into the river fog. Conveyor lines resumed their rhythm. Presses struck in sequence. The war had not slowed, but in the communications office near the yard, a teletype printer clattered through the silence, spooling out a narrow ribbon of paper marked Urgent, Field Report, Northern France. Karl Voss stood alone by the desk as the machine stuttered, its steel arms hammering out words he already suspected. Allied engineers near Cherbourg had been clearing runways struck during the previous night's raid. At 0742, a secondary blast occurred. Delayed, unpredicted. 2 casualties. No aircraft damage, but clearance operations halted. Then, hours later, another detonation. 6 hours after the first. The airfield shut down completely. Engineers refused to re-enter the zone. The report concluded with a single phrase. Enemy air operations delayed approximately 23 hours. He read it again, line by line. The timing intervals matched his failed coil sequence exactly. The deviation curve he had marked as within tolerance now repeated across an entire battlefield. His signature was nowhere on the paper, yet his work pulsed inside every figure. The factory would never see it that way. By noon, officers in the assembly division were already calling it a triumph of precision. The fuse delay, once an embarrassment, was being praised as deliberate brilliance. The Bremen model, they called it. To Karl, it was something else entirely. He felt the tremor of cause and effect like static in the air. Each tick of the clock in his office seemed heavier now. Every machine hum carried a rhythm he no longer trusted. The system had rewarded a mistake because it looked like control. The truth was simpler. A fault had survived because one man refused to erase it. The teleprinter clicked once more, spitting out a brief addendum. Unconfirmed rumor. Allied units refer to ordnance as ghost bombs, devices that wait. He tore the message free, folded it neatly, and held it for a long time before slipping it into his coat. There was no pride in his face, no fear either, just quiet comprehension. The realization that the fuse had done what he'd predicted, and more. Outside, the workday continued with the same mechanical certainty. Cranes turned above the siding. Freight cars creaked along rails, glistening with oil. The air vibrated faintly with the rhythm of engines starting in sequence. The same pattern, the same efficiency, untouched by the knowledge of what it had produced. Karl walked back through the machine hall. Workers greeted him with brief nods, unaware. The presses thundered in perfect unison. None of them knew that one imperfection, small, invisible, and uncorrected, had changed the tempo of an entire front. At his bench, the tools were where he'd left them. The test dial, the worn notebook, the steel fuse caps resting in a row. He placed the folded teleprint between the pages of his private logbook, then locked it in the drawer. No one would read it. The system didn't need to know who had made its miracle. He sat down, listening to the distant rhythm of the foundry. The sound of pistons, the hiss of pressure, the same old breath of industry continuing without pause. The machine never questioned its purpose. It only repeated. By evening, another convoy departed the yard. More crates, more fuses, more precision. The last light flickered across the frozen tracks before fading into smoke. Inside the quiet office, Karl remained still, his reflection faint in the frosted window. The machine of war continued to move forward, unaware that its rhythm now carried the signature of one man's hesitation. Systems rarely remember the hands that alter them. They remember only results. Would you have corrected the flaw, or let the silence decide the outcome? The inspection team arrived under a gray noon sky. Their car stopped beside the rail siding, engine ticking as the heat bled away. 2 officers stepped out, coats buttoned to the throat, their boots crunching over the frost-hardened gravel. They carried folders, not questions. In wartime Germany, inquiry had been replaced by confirmation. Inside the administrative wing, the debrief unfolded in the tone of routine. A long table, a single lamp, a stack of typed pages. Karl Voss stood straight behind his chair, hands locked behind his back. The senior investigator, a logistics colonel from Berlin, read the report aloud. Fuse model B14. Delay variance recorded under field conditions. Performance beyond specification. Functional outcome successful. The words fell one by one, clean, bureaucratic, untouched by consequence. No reprimand followed, no commendation either, just the sound of pen tips scratching across forms. Someone murmured about efficiency under pressure. Another called it resilience in design. The praise was mechanical, stripped of meaning, a chain of official language that disguised human intent. Karl heard none of it clearly. His mind wandered to the numbers on the page, the intervals between detonations. He remembered their rhythm, not as data, but as time passing, measured in silence and distance. The colonel closed the folder and slid it across the table. "You'll resume production next week," he said. "Berlin requests consistency." That was all. No one mentioned Cherbourg or the engineers who had died in the crater hours after the raid. No one traced the origin of the fuse deviation to a single factory night in Bremen. The machine of command had already folded the error into its own perfection. Karl signed where they told him to sign. The stamp came down with a sharp metallic clap. Official. Final. He nodded once without expression and left the room. In the corridor, the air smelled of hot paper and carbon ink. Typewriters rattled behind closed doors. The war machine never paused. It only redistributed its focus. Karl walked past the clerks, past the map-lined walls, until the noise thinned into the deeper hum of the factory floor. The presses were running again. Conveyor lines clanked, feeding new steel into molds. The same rhythm, the same heat, the same repetition that hid intention behind process. At his bench, his tools lay in perfect alignment. Calipers, soldering pen, resistance meter, each where he'd left them. He placed his gloves on the table and sat. The stopwatch beside him still ticked softly, unbroken, marking seconds that no longer meant precision. They carried memory instead. He could still see the workers frozen that morning when the crate hissed. He could still feel the warmth of the metal casing that had seemed to breathe under his hand. Machines, he thought, don't think. But they do remember what they're built for. He opened his private logbook, its spine creased from use. The final page was blank. For a long moment, he stared at it, then wrote a single line in small, precise letters. The delay is not in the fuse, but in the system itself. The words sat clean on the paper, deliberate, unadorned. He read them twice. Then he tore the page out, folded it once, and slid it into the waste bin. In its place, he began a new entry: temperature readings, coil resistances, production notes, ordinary numbers, nothing more. The stopwatch ticked on. By dusk, the investigation team had departed. The sound of their car faded down the road, swallowed by the distance. Inside the foundry, the presses struck their steady rhythm once again, iron against iron. Karl turned to his next assignment, the same as before. Outwardly, he complied. Inwardly, he knew that nothing in the system ever truly stopped. Not machines, not orders, not decisions. They only delayed. Industrial systems remember through repetition. What they forget, men carry. Would you have erased the line or let it remain? When the war ended, the ruins of industry spoke louder than its records. In workshops once filled with the sound of steel, there was only the wind moving through broken glass. Allied ordnance teams walked those silent factories, cataloging what remained. Among the crates of discarded mechanisms, they found a set of delay fuses marked Model B14. Each bore identical serial codes, yet field reports showed no two had behaved the same. The files labeled it temperature reactive, detonation variance. The engineers called it innovation, a mechanical, Design that had extended the danger of German air raids long after the planes had gone. No one mentioned a man. The fuse's irregularity was treated as a feature of the machine, not the product of choice. In post-war studies, the weapon appeared only in tables and diagrams. Delay curves plotted against altitude, thermal change, humidity. The reports praised its unpredictability. They called it passive defense. The weapon that had once frightened engineers on both sides was now a technical curiosity. Elsewhere, in a power plant outside Hamburg, Karl Voss returned to his trade. He repaired turbines again, the same kind he had worked on before the war. His name had not appeared in any tribunal, nor in any archive. To the system, he was an efficient worker with steady hands and no record of disloyalty. To himself, he was something else entirely. A man calibrated by hesitation. Each day began as it once had. The low hum of dynamos, the smell of oil and metal, the rhythm of engines settling into balance. He traced current through copper coils, listening for irregularities. Each fault he found reminded him of that winter in Bremen. The sound of a fuse hissing under heat. The weight of a decision that never left his hands. The machines around him no longer served destruction, yet their pulse felt the same. Regular, relentless, indifferent. He no longer kept a logbook. Only small notes tucked between manuals. Resistance values, maintenance times, fragments of thought. One, written faintly in pencil, read, "Precision hides uncertainty. It only waits for the right temperature to return." When the supervisor inspected his bench, the note was gone. Karl had already folded it into his pocket. The years passed without recognition. The fuse design, copied by several nations for post-war munitions testing, became a footnote in technical journals. Bremen-type delay mechanism, source unknown. Historians cited it as an example of German engineering efficiency. None suspected it began as a flaw preserved by choice. By 1950, Karl's hair had gone gray at the edges. He still carried the same stopwatch, its casing worn thin from years of use. When he serviced it, he could feel the faint unevenness in its movement, a small variance that no amount of oil or filing could correct. He never fixed it. He let it remain. The imperfection marked time better than accuracy ever could. He rarely spoke of the war, but when asked, he once said quietly, "Machines don't decide. Men leave decisions inside them." Then he returned to work, adjusting a turbine's alignment, listening to the hum of its blades until the rhythm steadied. History remembered the fuse as an engineering success, an advancement in delay systems that prolonged the war's reach. Karl remembered it differently. A hesitation written into steel, a delay that had outlived its maker. Even decades later, when he walked through the power stations of a rebuilt Germany, the echo followed him, the ticking of unseen fuses, waiting somewhere in the dark. The war's rhythm had never fully stopped. It had only been absorbed into the systems that replaced it. Machines keep memory through motion. What they forget, men carry in silence.